It's Maker Monday, and we are finally coming to the end of Traverse. So we've made all our rows, we've put all our pieces together, we've got everything laid out. I'm going to show you a couple of workarounds that I found with my quilt personally. I had a couple of rows that were too short, a couple of rows that were too long, some things that I learned in putting it together that I'm going to pass on to you so you don't have to make the same screw ups as me. Okay, so remember at the beginning of doing Traverse, I told you to keep everything. This is my box O, keep everything. So some things, like when I did my strip sets, I had some pieces left over. Some pieces are just little pieces, and I kept all the colors on the little pieces. I kept everything so that when I got to the end of this project, if I found that I needed a little piece of fabric of this or a little joint of that or whatever, or I forgot to cut my sashing strips, whatever it is, I always keep everything until I get to the end of the project. Once I get to the end of the project though, if you want to go back and watch my crumb quilt video where I show you how I process all my scraps, I will take all these scraps and I will cut them into pieces of things that make sense. So I will cut them into 5-inch squares, 2.5-inch strips, and or 2.5-inch squares. Then I will throw the rest of them in a bucket that I call crumbs, which some of them are already in here, okay? So that way, if you kept, like I suggested at the beginning, all of your pieces in here, I had pieces left over of every single color. When I got to a row that was too short, and I had 2 of them that were too short, I went and found the fabric in the bin, I cut out what I needed, I added it on, we were cool. I had 2 rows that were too long. I don't know how, but they were. So I'm going to show you how I worked around that process, but I also had to go into my bin and I had to find the fabric so that I could fix that. Now I'm going to show you how my rows laid out, and I'm going to show you how I fixed those couple of other ones. Then I'm going to give you tips on sewing these rows together. So here you can see that I've got all my rows laid out on the table. I'm about to sew them together. Except for the last 3 rows, they wouldn't fit on the table, but you get the idea. So what I did was I got out in the back of the book, there's a layout of the rows of where they go together with which color sashing goes in each place. So what I did was I took all my sashing strips, I sewed them together on the diagonal like a binding piece. I also went and measured every one of my rows to make sure that they all finished the required length. I will say that I had a couple of rows that were too short and a couple of rows that are too long. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to fix that. For instance, this one right here, this sort of checkerboard one, all 3 of my rows, this table is exactly 72.5 inches, which is what the length of my rows should be. All of my rows are right about 1 inch too short, which means either I did something wrong or I don't really know. But either way, it's an easy fix. I'm going to take a piece of this color here. I'm going to sew 1.25 inches on, or whatever it is to get to my 72. I'll do the math there. I'm just going to add a little strip onto here. My flying geese rows, which there are 2. The other one I already fixed. It's on the other table. This one's too long. So what I did was I took the last flying geese block off of either end, and then I took the outside color and I added a strip to here on both ends, because I didn't want to cut my flying goose down and make it sort of cockeyed. So instead what I did was I took these 2 off the outside and I put the background piece here to make it look like a frame. So those are the only things that didn't quite work out the way that they were supposed to. All right. Next, I'm going to talk about a couple of tips to join your pieces together. All right, the first thing I'm going to suggest as a tip is when you're putting these straight pieces onto your blocks. So I'm going to match, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 1 row and I'm going to match a sashing strip to each row, and I'm going to sew them all at once, and then I'm going to sew them to each other. So it's not going to take that long to put this together. The biggest tip I'm going to give you though is measure your strips, your rows and your strips to be exactly the same length. But the most important part with putting these together, This is going to be heavier than this. Gravity is going to pull this if you sew this to this without pinning it. Yes, I know it's a little bit extra work, but come on, you guys have put all kinds of hours into this. Take the extra 30 seconds and pin this together. If you don't believe me, go ahead and sew these together without pinning. I promise you that when you get to the end of this row right here is going to be about that much longer than this row. Because this is heavier, this is going to pull, this is going to get sucked up too much, and you're going to run short. So what I suggest you do is you put this together the same way you would put border on your quilt. Pin the ends, fold this in half, find the middle, pin it in the middle. So here's one half of my row that I just pinned. So I pinned on the end, I pinned in the middle, and then I did what I like to call I split the difference. I pinned in the middle of those two, and then in the middle of those two, and then in the middle of those two. You don't have to pin this to death. You don't have to put a pin every inch. You don't have to pin it crazy like, okay? Just enough to hold it down. You'll also notice that I did my weird pinning technique where my pin is outside of the seam allowance. The reason for that is I'm going to suggest this again, that you sew from this side, not this side. The reason for that is your feed dogs are going to move easier on this single piece without seams in it. And if you sew from this side, you can make sure that your sewing intersects that point right there, which means you won't cut your points off. All right. You're just going to get a better seam if you sew it from this side. Also, since I like to use my 1/4 inch piecing foot, I'm going to trim these dog ears before I start sewing. And honestly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my very best to intersect right there as I'm sewing this seam along. All right. So those are my tips for putting your rows together. So remember I said that I had to make my flying geese block a little bit different. So what I did was I took this last goose block off. I sewed in a piece of fabric. I haven't finished pressing this yet, but I sewed a piece of fabric that was my background piece on. And then when I put my rows on, since I sewed from the other side and I could make sure I intersect it, I didn't cut off any of the points of my geese. Then I'm going to press everything toward these sashing strips because there's less bulk if you press them toward these. And then see how they all line up really nicely? That was part of that pinning. When I showed you how to lay these all out to pin them, remember we pinned on the ends and we pinned in the middle and we split the difference. So I've sewn this all together along my my sashing strips. I'm going to pull all of my pins out. The pressing part of this is one of those times where I really like steam. And this fabric, since this fabric frays a little bit, I'm going to give you some tips. So here's my whole long strips, right? I'm going to, with my steam on my iron, I'm going to set my seam. Always set your seam before you start pressing it. And since I want to press toward all of my sashing strips, my sashing strip is always going to be facing upward. All right, so I set my seam first. Then as I'm pressing this open, just like I've shown you a million times on pressing, you're just going to use the weight of the iron to press this toward your sashing strip. Now, since I pinned it the way that I did, and I sewed it the way that I did, where I sewed it from the back side and intersected those, I went across those intersections right there, my pieces are going to come out perfect on the front. All right. The reason I like to press like this is because by pressing toward my sashing strips, I'm pressing away from the bulk of my seams. So everything's going to lay much flatter. My pieces are all going to show up nice. And this is like instant gratification, y'all. Do your long armor a favor. Since there is a bit more shedding, if you will, with these woven fabrics, please, as you're sewing these rows together, pull these loose threads out. It's better to pull them out than cut them, Because if you cut it, as you start to wiggle this around and move it, the end is just going to come back out again. So if you find these pieces like this, pull on it. It's pulling from this way, see? Put your hand on the quilt and pull that thread out as much as you can get. And sometimes it'll pull from, sometimes you'll end up with this really long thread, and sometimes it'll just break off. Either way, pull those threads out. So I'm going to finish putting all of these rows together. And look at how pretty this is. Like the color combinations, it's so rich and vibrant. And now that I have steam pressed all of these pieces, look at how flat that is. So here's my finished traverse quilt. I am in love with this quilt. So if you aren't sure if you want to make it, or you were kind of on the fence to see how it went together, and you don't have the kit yet, we just made a whole new set of kits, so we do have kits in stock. I think this was a great skill building project, and it was really fun to do. And the colors are so amazing.